My name is Phil Ringstrom. I'm a member of the Sartell Lions. We've been around for approximately 50 years in Sartell. I think we're most noted for Lions Park, but numerous community support endeavors that we've had throughout the years. I want to say, when we had our 50th anniversary a while back, a couple old timers, if we may, Bob Pagachnik, one of the charter members, and Tim O'Driscoll. And they helped us with the Lions Park get going, plus a current member we still have, Mike DeLuca, who helped design Sartell Park for the visually impaired. And now we look at it as a park to be inclusive for all folks. With that park connection along the Watap Creek, we've also noticed how over the years the park has been nourished by gardeners from the community, a lot of volunteers, and we're very grateful for those great volunteers, and we continue to be. We're looking for more volunteers in the city, but on behest of Sartell Lions, we ourselves are looking for Sartell Lions members also. But that's all beside the point. The main point for today being Earth Day is for us to recognize and celebrate the fact that we have still green spaces in Sartell. And as relatively natural as they can be, considering the development we've had over the years. But with that comes changes, and with that comes humanism of waste and decay, and what do we do with it, and how do we crowd things. So we felt on Earth Day it's important for us to bring in a few experts for the Sartell community, and to help us with a better understanding from these experts of what we can do as good stewards and citizens of central Minnesota, if not Sartell. We're also very fortunate to have Bitstream streaming this event tonight. Being a great day out there, I'm sure there's a lot of souls that says, well, there's that thing, but I think it's such a nice day, I'm going to enjoy the earth rather than study about it. However one might feel about the weather, but thank goodness we're streaming this on Bitstream TV, which you can access on YouTube's channel, and there'll be further information coming out through the chamber and further publicity on how that'll be accessed. And maybe later in our presentation, I'll give you more specifics on how you can access this down the road. But for tonight, the sequence of our speakers, we're going to start with Katie Duritz, who is from the Extension Office of the University of Minnesota in Stearns County here. Katie, if you don't mind, please come forward. She has warmly and gladly, she was my first recipient to say, sure, I'll do this. What do you want me to do? And I couldn't tell her what I wanted her to do. I said, you're the expert, so let's see what you have. So Katie, welcome, and thank you for being here.
Thank you so much. All right, well, thank you, everyone. As Phil mentioned, my name is Katie Duritz. I'm a local extension educator for horticulture, small farms, and local foods in Stearns, Benton, and Morrison County, so I cover the Tri-County area. It's been a while since I've been in front of a live crowd. It's kind of fun to see all of you and to feed off of that. So as we get started tonight, as Phil said, he didn't give me a ton of direction in where I was going, so I really just wanted to think about the tips and tricks as we are looking at our yards, and a lot of this goes to parks and other green spaces as well. All right. So, properly planting our trees. I've got quite a few things up there that we want to talk about here. The first one there is trees are not fence posts. Okay, so when you are planting a tree or you're walking around the neighborhood, a tree at the bottom of it, you should see a nice flare. So in our document here, we have that nice little flare out in the bottom of the picture there. That needs to be at ground level. If that is not at ground level, what happens, if that's below the ground, is our roots actually start to circle around our trunk and strangle that tree to death. And then we have a dead tree. okay? And if you've bought trees in the past, you know they can be a pretty big investment into the property that you are putting that tree on. So we certainly don't want to shorten that tree's life. And that can happen pretty quickly if we plant our trees too deeply. And I see this, unfortunately, all over the place. As I walk through towns and communities, I see all of these trees. And so the not fence posts, if you think about it, a tree should have that nice flare. You think about the little kid drawings of a tree and they've got that nice little flare at the bottom. That's what we want our trees to look like out in nature, not straight into the ground like a telephone pole, or I'm a farm girl, so a fence post. All right. And the other one I have here is avoid volcanoes, choose donuts. Seems like pretty good daily advice, but really what we're talking about here is when we go to mulch around our trees. Quite often we want to provide that mulch around the trees so that our lawnmowers don't get too close to them, which is also great because scraping up the outside of that tree with a lawnmower is really bad. So the mulch is a good idea. But oftentimes we see that there's this big kind of volcanoed up mulch that goes part of the way up the tree. It's touching the trunk all the way around. That's really what we want to avoid. Instead, we want nice flat out away from the tree and actually away from the trunk of the tree by just a little bit. So having that kind of donut hole in the middle. And there's quite a few reasons for this. The main one being, if we pile up that mulch around the trunk of the tree, we are actually encouraging moisture to sit there and we can rot out the bottom of that trunk. We have more insect activity, and it's just causing a lot of problems. And so if we keep that mulch out, we do that donut formation, we're going to be a lot better off. All right, don't behead them. This happens quite often when trees that get too tall are under like your electrical line or your telephone lines, and then either yourself or the city comes through and chops them off at the top, okay? That is a very slow, painful way to kill your tree, all right? Your tree is not going to survive that. So when we are looking at planting our trees, the best thing we can do is look at what is the mature size of that tree, both height and width. And then take a look around and get out your tape measure and say, okay, if my tree is going to be 50 feet tall, oh, that telephone pole is only up there 30 feet. I really shouldn't plant this tree under the telephone line, okay? Or close to our houses. That happens quite often too, where when that tree is pretty small, it looks like a great location to plant that tree, but we have to think about mature size and height because that's our goal at the end of the day with our trees is maturity. And so we want to make sure that we are away from those buildings and other things. It also keeps you from having to do quite as much pruning, which saves you money in the long run as well. And then finally, let the roots breathe. So quite often, I get the question of, well, my maple tree in my backyard has a bunch of roots at the top of the soil, and I'm always tripping over them. I just want to cut them off. Please don't do that. That is cutting off the life source to your tree. If you go out and you walk through the woods, naturally planted area, and you kind of scrape your feet along the ground, you're going to hit tree roots because that is where they are meant to be. Our tree roots actually need oxygen, and so there are going to be roots that are right at that soil surface. So if you have tree roots like that, congratulations, you have a properly planted tree. Okay, so we want to keep that in mind as we go through there, and also that might determine where you plant that tree, because if you really don't want roots like that in your yard, then maybe a tree in that space isn't the best option. All right? Okay, trees drink a lot of water. I think most of us know this, that our trees are going to drink quite a bit of water. But the biggest thing to remember is that trees take quite a bit of time to actually establish into our landscape. And oftentimes we see, people are really, really good at watering our trees right after we plant them, maybe for that first summer, and then we kind of stop watering them because we think, it's pretty good. But really, it depends on the size of the tree. And when we're talking about trunk caliper, what that means is you go up about a foot on the trunk of the tree and you measure across the width of that trunk. And what that measurement is, we go across here. So if you have a 2-inch caliper tree, it needs 3 years of weekly watering of 2 to 3 gallons each week. Now that includes any rainfall and things like that that we get, so you have to take all of that into consideration, but we need to be watering those trees for the length of time that it takes those roots to be established. And I have some awesome printouts that also talk about properly planting our trees, because when we are planting, we only want to dig as deep as that root ball after we found that flare, that collar, okay, which could be down 6 inches or so. We got to find that first. And then we only want to plant it that deep, but we want to go twice as wide, because our tree roots are going to spread outwards, not so much downwards. They'll go down a little bit, but not nearly as much as they're going to go out. So by loosening up that soil around that root ball, we give the roots better starting point of getting out into the soil. All right. So then we get into our garden. So with our trees, we have, we talked about watering, we talked about planting. Getting into the garden, the best thing that you can do for your garden is knowing your soil. So the type of soil that you have depends on how much water it's going to require. If you have a really, really sandy soil, that water is going to drain out very quickly. Your plants are going to need to be watered more often. If you have a heavier clay type soil, you're not going to need as much water because that clay really holds on to that water quite a bit. So we have to know what our soil is. Easiest way to do that is through a soil test. I brought some soil test sheets with me today. They're on the back table. And the best thing you can do is take a look at getting that done. We recommend once every 3 years to get your soil tested. Your texture probably isn't going to change. Your pH might, depending on what you're doing. That's going to be how acidic or how alkaline your soil is, and that will determine what types of plants grow best in your soil. It also determines the bioavailability of our nutrients. So we have tons of nutrients in our soil, which is fantastic, but if our pH is off too much to one side or the other, the ability for that plant to take up those nutrients is severely limited. So we have to know what that pH is, and we don't want to just amend thinking we know what it is, because quite often we don't. So we want to make sure that we actually know through science-based tests. And then beyond that, it's going to talk to us about phosphorus and our potassium levels. Quite often, most of the soil tests that I see that people bring to me and they've gotten their test done, we have plenty of phosphorus and plenty of potassium, and we don't need to be adding that. But I don't know that until we get a soil test. Our soil test results will not tell you how much nitrogen is in your soil, because nitrogen changes forms very, very easily and is very mobile. So the nitrogen requirement is going to be based on your practices in your garden or in your lawn. All right, so then understanding your plants. So we have our soil, we figured out what our soil is. Now we're going to plant things that do well in that environment. And the best thing that you can do is really research your plants, get to know them. Do they like sandy soil? Do they like a lot of sunshine? Do they like to only be watered on occasion? There are plants that like to dry out a little bit before they get watered again. And the best thing to do is get to know them, because if we don't do that, we actually end up with our plants dying. And again, if we're doing this investment into our land and into our space, we want to make sure that we are doing the things to keep them healthy. All right, the next thing is to water early in the day. By watering early in the day, we are watering before we get to the heat of the day. That allows for a couple of things. It allows for our plants to get a good strong drink of water before they get super, super hot. And it also allows for, if you accidentally got some water on the leaves or the flowers, it allows for that to dry out throughout the day. If we don't allow for that, we can actually lead to disease and fungal issues that are going to happen to our plants, which can be very stressful, which leads to our plants dying. So we want to make sure that we're watering as early in the day as we can to give the plants the best chance. And then, do any of you guys in here have rain barrels? using rain barrels currently? Okay, awesome.
For our community gardens in Sartell,
Okay.
we catch water out the water treatment plant.
Yep.
So we store maybe about 600 some gallons after a good rain.
Okay.
And then we put that out into the gardens and people put the rainwater onto their, we have 96 gardens on the west side,
Okay.
10 on the east side.
Are these produce gardens?
Produce gardens?
Yeah, like
Yes.
vegetables? Okay. So I'm a little cautious there because the reason for that is rainwater often comes off a roof or a structure.
Yep.
And roofs and structures have poop on them. Bird poop, squirrel poop, all kinds of poop. All right, and that gets into the water, which can then get into your produce, especially depending on how you're watering. So in an abundance of caution, I would not recommend using rain barrel water on produce gardens. Now, if you are, and that's the only water source you have, you just want to be very careful that we are watering at the base of that plant. Because we actually have research that shows, you know, when a tomato plant flowers and that flower is what turns into our tomato, we have research that shows that if a foodborne illness like salmonella, for instance, was in that water and got on that flower, the salmonella would now be in the tomato when it grows. It's mind-blowing to me every time I think about that. So we want to be very careful to keep that water at the base of the plant, the stem, where it's not touching that flowering part. And if possible, using our rainwater on flowers, on native plantings, things that we're not going to be eating. Make sense? All right. Okay, so then when it comes to our lawn, again, we want to know our soil. We want to know what we are working with. And if you leave your clippings on your lawn, you are actually providing your soil with a lot of the nutrients it needs, and you can cut down on fertilizer that you might otherwise have to apply. So that's always something to keep in the back of your mind. If you are choosing to bag your clippings, that's totally fine, but then your soil is going to need more things added back to it. So if you're looking at how can I put less things out there, how can I not have to purchase and apply fertilizer, leaving your clippings on your lawn is one of the easiest ways to achieve that. Pay attention to the weather. So if you're going to be using an irrigation system, one of my biggest pet peeves is driving down the road and it's pouring rain and the irrigation system is going, okay? It just drives me crazy. And there are programs that you can actually either set it so it's manually, so you only turn it on like, hey, we haven't had a lot of water, my lawn actually needs it, so now I'm going to use my irrigator. Or you can get really fancy, and there are systems that actually put probes in the soil that measures the moisture level down where the actual roots are. And then that tells your system, hey, we need water, or nope, we don't actually need any water right now, we're good. So if you are going to do that, I would strongly recommend one of those two options to be the most water conscious. Now, that's not to say that you have to water your lawn. You can absolutely, when I get down here to checking your expectations, it is okay to have a slightly brown lawn in July in the middle of a drought. It's totally fine, okay? So those are the things that we just kind of have to think about is, what are we expecting out of our lawn? Do we want it to be perfectly green from April 22nd all the way through November 1st? Or are we okay with a bit of ebb and flow based on this year's weather? And that's really up to you as the homeowner or the park maintenance, whatever it might be, to make that decision. Auditing your irrigation system, if you have one, that's really important to make sure that one, you're not spraying half of your water onto a sidewalk or driveway, because that's a big waste. And two, to make sure that you are getting even irrigation throughout the entire system, and not more in some places and less in others. So there's simple tools that you can use that. Again, I have another printout on that if that's something that you're looking to do. The other best thing that you can do is choose drought-resistant varieties, and also mow your grass to a higher height. So a grass's roots are proportional to how tall it is. So if you have a 3-inch above ground, you have at least 3 inches below the ground. So if we continually cut our lawn super, super short, we end up not having very much root growth, which means that we can't access very much water. So especially in the hot summer months, if you have the ability to raise your lawnmower blades to about 4 inches, you can do yourself a huge favor in making your grass more drought resistant because it can access more water further down into the soil. All right, we've talked about soil testing. That's up there. I really don't recommend weed and feed systems. So if you are someone who has a crabgrass control issue and you're trying to do that as well as fertilize, that's great. But I really don't recommend doing them at the same time. Crabgrass emergence this year to apply a pre-emergent, so before it comes out of the ground, needed to happen about April 6th through the 10th, and fertilizer happens in May. So those two are very far away from each other. So I really don't recommend a product that's trying to do both of them at the same time. Again, going back to the soil testing, only feed your grass what it actually needs. If you have plenty of phosphorus and potassium, there is zero reason to add more phosphorus and potassium to your soil. And then practice proper timing. We have a really great lawn care calendar. Again, it's in the handouts back there that talks about when is the best time to do different practices and when is an okay time to do them, where you're still going to get pretty good results, just not as good. All right, that is all I had prepared for today, but I would love to answer any questions that you all have, whether about what I presented on or pretty much anything horticulture.
Well, that's wonderful, Katie. And when they ask a question, could you repeat it for the streaming?
Absolutely.
So
Yes.
are you saying right now it's actually too late if you want to apply something for crabgrass?
It's
been rather cool. I mean, it's been freezing almost every night.
Yes. Okay, so the question is it too late to apply for crabgrass? My favorite extension answer, it depends. Have you seen crabgrass emergence in your lawn? If the answer is no, and you had crabgrass last year, then you can probably still apply your pre-emergence. I would still wait on your fertilizer. If your crabgrass is already up and growing like a weed that it does, then you're too late for a pre-emergent and it's time to look at a post-emergent.
Okay. Thank you.
Yep.
Yeah.
Other questions? Any questions online?
Yep, love to. Absolutely.
Anyone plant any trees today? Get that done? Did you do it right?
Katie, I have a question.
Yeah.
Pruning trees. Now, my tree pruner was scheduled to come about 3 weeks ago, and he said they're almost starting to bud. We might want to wait till next year. And so I chose to do that.
Okay.
Is that a good decision, or do we still have time?
What kind of trees do you have?
I have oak,
Okay.
and I have some maple.
Okay. So the question is, what is the proper timing to prune trees? He has oak trees and maple trees. Your oak trees, do not prune them right now, please. We are in very heavy oak wilt season from now until the end of July. And in my mind, we're really in it until about the end of October. And the reason for that is from July to October, we're in a low risk time, but we have quite a bit of oak wilt here in Stearns-Benton County. So best time to prune an oak tree, November through February, maybe early March, depending on what the weather's doing. Maple tree, on the other hand, you're safe to prune it, but it's best to prune it February, March timeframe. But you don't have the risk of disease issues that you have with your oak tree right now. So just, it depends. Like my maple tree is getting pruned the end of May because that's when they could get me in. And it's rubbing on my roof, so it needs to get done. But, yeah.
Thank you. I have another
Yes.
question. On fertilizing your lawn, I missed
Okay.
part of that with the question on the crabgrass. But what about, I have a bag of Farmer Bob's fertilizer.
Okay.
Should I put that on now, 2 weeks ago? Or I just don't want to put it on the wrong time, and
So my first question is, have you had a soil test
not this year.
in the last 3 years?
Yes.
Okay. All right. So the question is, when does he apply his lawn fertilizer? He has had a soil test, so I am going to make the assumption that he is applying the correct fertilizer based on the soil test that he got. You are actually still too early at this point. You would want to do it about mid-May. The best time is actually about September-ish. And I have a lawn care calendar in the back that you can take with you for reference.
Wonderful.
Yes.
Recently, on a trip to Florida and back,
Okay.
going through the states of, Tennessee and Kentucky and Alabama, saw a emerging buds on a plant called a red bud. And beautiful, beautiful blossoms. And so my question is, A, can that be planted in this area? And then B, is that readily available?
You know, I would have to look up I know what trees you're talking about because I was just down there and they're gorgeous. I would have to look up if we have hardy versions. So the biggest thing that you're looking for when you go to a nursery is buying plants that are in our zone. Okay, so that is our growing zone. Typically in this area, we're about 3B, sometimes 4A, depending on the plant a little bit. So as long as it's in our hardiness zone, you can get away with it. There are some people that try to grow zone 5 here. It's a little more risky if we have a really cold winter and you want to make sure to cover it up and do stuff like that. But if you're in that zone 3 to 4 range, if you can find one, you should be good to go.
Thank you.
Yep. You looked like you had a question.
What's the addition of the A and the B?
Excellent question. So the question is, what is the difference between zone A and B? It's in the same large zone, but it's just broken down just a little bit further. Typically when we're looking at plants, it's not a huge deal. It's just a temperature difference of how cold we get. So it's like halfway in between the full scale.
Okay. A is south, B is north?
Correct. Yes.
Okay.
Any other questions for Katie? And thank you, Katie.
yeah.
You say you have handouts out there?
Yep, my handouts are in the back. I thought there were going to be more people here, so I killed a lot of trees and printed a bunch. So if you have friends or neighbors or things that you think could benefit, please take them. They will get used eventually, but they're here. So
Thank you, Katie.
thank you.
Guys, I like the sense of humor about cutting down trees. That's the way the world turns. Right now, getting ready for our next presenter, Josh Richardson from Prairie Restorations. I'm going to let him get set up. I got a couple more things, a couple more commercials, actually. What Katie just talked about in her handouts, we will not let those go to waste. We will make sure those are going to be distributed, whether we do it through here or we do it through our endeavors at Lions Park or somewhere in the community. I want to bring to your attention, as we plan for today's event, the community education booklet that was sent out has some classes that you can access. And some of them have taken place by Zoom prior to today. Some of them are happening, and that's why I have these handouts. Native plants for small spaces and containers, Tuesday, April 29th. And then you have different classes that I will hand out to you, or you can pick up. And I just think that opportunity with with the education we're receiving tonight, opportunities we should not ignore. I want to add a little bit more about our Sartell Lions and the work that we do. We're having our annual cleanup this Saturday, and that is our largest fundraiser. And the intent to that, again, follows the aspect of Earth Day. We want to make sure that things are disposed of properly, the appliances, the tires, or whatever you might have for rubbish and debris. You can deposit with us at the middle school Saturday at Sartell Middle School. I think it's called Riverside Middle School in Sartell from 8 to noon. Intermediate. Thank you.
Old high school.
Yes, for Riverview Intermediate School. Thank you. And let's see. I do want to mention tonight, with us we have our president, Stu Giffen, who has been at the helm for a couple, 3 years now, who has really helped with our initiative of our club to grow and also to accentuate on what our purpose is. And one of the pillars of Lions, especially our founder, Helen Keller, on the visually impaired and the mobility impaired park, which is our mainstay, but also one of the pillars of Lions is the environment. And that's another reason that we're holding today's forum. Next is Josh Richardson. You got your computer figured out, my friend? Awesome. Josh is a staff member of Prairie Restoration. Prairie Restorations is an entity that he'll talk about, but they are also an agency that contracts with the city of Sartell. If you've noticed at City Hall that there's some natural plantings around the city where that bridge is at on the by Burnix, that is planted and maintained by Prairie Restoration. Josh probably has more insight into what they do for Sartell, but this isn't the reason we connected with them is because of basically of who they are. And Josh will explain that more in detail, but he also offers us in our Lions Club expertise and knowledge at no cost. If you noticed, our buckthorn removal demonstration project on Pinecone Road, Josh took some time here a couple weeks ago and explained to us on our next phases of how we should manage that. And with that knowledge, which is to me, there's no unlimited cost that you can put on the title of what we learn. And we're very grateful for Josh's presence tonight. So welcome, Josh. It's all yours.
Phil. Thanks a lot. I'll take this thing off. Thanks for having me. Again, my name's Josh Richardson. I have been part of the Prairie Restorations Incorporated team for like almost 23 years. One day I worked in the greenhouse at St. Cloud State, and we had a little prairie outside of our greenhouse, and I kind of fell in love with it. And when I finished college, somebody gave me Ron Bowen's phone number, the owner, the founder, and I called him up and he asked me a couple questions. He said, "What's the scientific name of big blue stem?" And I said, "Andropogon gerardi," and a couple other plants, and he's like, "You're hired. Bring a pair of work boots." So here, 23 years later, here I am. But the neat thing about Prairie Restorations is that, well, our motto is to bring people together with the land. We are a private company, and a pretty unique private company. There's more companies like us now, but when we were founded, we were really one of the first. And so, as far as we can tell, from our founding in 1977, we were we are the oldest continually operating full-service ecological restoration company in the United States. We are mission-driven. This should be in much bigger print, our mission. This is everything right here. To produce and provide the most ecologically appropriate seeds, plants, products, and services, and utilize them to restore and manage native plant communities. It's kind of a mouthful, but I think the key word is native plant communities. So what we do, we don't just like native plants, we try to recreate native plant communities. And there's a lot of benefits to that, a lot of ecological benefits that I'll try to touch on. There's a lot I could talk about in a short time. But we are ecological restoration focused, ecology, the understanding of plant communities and species is at the core of what we do. Seed and plant sciences. We also are very service oriented. Our goal is to get projects on the ground, make them happen, get them planted, get them growing. And it takes time to get them growing, and there's management processes, vegetation management processes that we do during the establishment period. So this is all stuff that we do every day. We touch base on this really quick. I don't want to get too much into the details, but we have 6 locations right now. And our Princeton office, where I work, is where most of our main operations are, main seed production, main plant production. But we have various service locations as well in Watertown, in Scandia, in Cannon Falls, and newest one is down in Lewiston in southeast Minnesota. We also have our boreal natives site, which is really an interesting one up in Duluth, where we really focus on a whole different kind of plants. The plants of the Arrowhead region of Minnesota, the northern region plants, are very different than what we deal with down here. So we've got 70 full-time employees, 40 seasonals in a typical year. Most of us have degrees in biological science. We offer planting services, installation, as I mentioned, vegetation management services. We produce our own seeds and plants. And we also have a retail store. This little map is kind of our guide. This is based on a map that was created by a guy named Francis Marshner. It is a map that was based on the public land surveys of the 1840s, 50s, 60s. What they did is they went around and surveyed every single town, every single section and township and all that, and took notes about what was growing there. And they created this map. So you can see 3 real distinct general regions up in the Arrowhead. These are a lot of the sort of plant communities are associated with the mixed pine forest, but there's bogs up in the north and all sorts of different stuff. These greens and browns, that's more of a transitional deciduous forest area. The browns are like oak savanna or oak woodlands. And you start seeing these yellows, that's prairie. And now you know that most of that prairie is corn or soybeans right now. So that's where you've seen the most dramatic changes in the landscape, is in the prairie region. I believe it's estimated that only 1% of the original prairie remains. So we use native plant communities as a model. So we look at that map. Oftentimes if we have a customer, we pinpoint them on that map and we say, oh, this is interesting. They were in the oak savanna region, or they were this was wet prairie, or different things like that. So we take these remnant plant communities and we use them as a model for what we choose to do. I don't know if you can see this, but we definitely need to adjust and adapt to whatever nature is going to give us, and sometimes that's herbivory. Restoration doesn't happen overnight. This is a recently restored stream bank that we did up in the Duluth region. It takes time to revegetate that. It doesn't just suddenly grow. It might take 3 years to get maturity in a native planting. So when we do a native planting, we're using seed, we're using plants. In this case, it looks kind of like a big mud pit, but this is an infiltration basin at a National Guard facility that was struggling, and we got in and we replanted it, and it's doing great now. But we planted about 20,000 plants in 10,000 square feet. It were really a lot of plants. Because the water was going up and down a lot, we needed to get growth fast. So, and this is my front yard. I have a shady front yard. I have oak trees above, and so I decided that I needed to do more of a woodland savannah restoration in my front yard. So you see wild geranium here. There's some other. It's a little hard for me to see the details here, but there's maidenhair fern and things like that, and asters and all sorts of ferns. And it does pretty well. It does pretty well. I don't have to do too much with it. I've taken out about half of my turf in my yard, and I'm hoping to take out more in the next few years. And it's really fun. To me, the thing that I like to sell people on with native plantings is that it's a lifelong learning experience. It's when you embrace the concept and you decide to do a project, whether it's a little patch the size of this table or hundreds of acres, you embark on a journey of learning about how we can change things, how we can go back to bringing back diversity and wildlife habitat, pollinator habitat, all that stuff. So we see it's more obvious on these large scale plantings. This is one over by River Bluff Park in St. Cloud that's really kind of a lovely project. I think Sartell City Hall is a nice project too, as much as I know of it. I haven't managed it a lot myself, but I personally work with wetlands a lot. I love wetlands. I think they pose unique challenges. And this photo is actually kind of on the fringe of a wetland. It has a little bit of upland vegetation in it too. But they're, a totally unique set of plant species adapted to wetlands. I've worked with shorelines a lot too, so we get into this bioengineering stuff. So bioengineering would be where you come up with a solution that stabilizes everything, but it's not just rock or concrete or whatever. So here we're using coconut fiber materials to stabilize the shoreline, and then we get in and we seed it and we plant it with something that's resilient, that can handle the changes of the fluctuating water levels and the wave action and all that. And this one, I don't have a newer picture of this, but this one's establishing quite nice. That's in the West Metro. And here's just some pictures of, we do a lot of stream channel work. It's very interesting. It's hard work, and a lot of times we end up doing it in the winter time because that's when you can work in the streams. Now that varies depending on where the stream is located. I'm guessing you'll hear more about that later in the next presentation. But here you see a lot of erosion control fabric being put down. So you have to stabilize the soil and give the planting a chance to establish. So here we're planting in the snow in November in a big kind of infiltration area. Here's one at the river. You might know this one, the greenhouses at Riverside Park in St. Cloud. That's a planting that we did about 8 years ago. I helped plant that, and I walk my dog past it all the time. It's pretty. It's a nice planting, and it serves a function. The deep. We were talking about the height of the grass, and she was telling the story before me about how the roots are as deep as the height of the grass. With prairie grasses, actually, little blue stem, for example, is 3.5 feet tall, or maybe 3 feet tall. The roots might be 9 feet deep. So that has implications when you have water falling on an area in really fast. It absorbs it quicker. It helps the water infiltrate better. Having that root system in there, it creates channels for that water to follow down into the root system. In fact, those deep roots are what created the beautiful topsoil we have in our best farming areas in Minnesota. So we provide a wide range of services. Here you're seeing a young prairie that was just planted being mowed. And the reason we mow it is because the first thing that comes up is annual weeds, and they can choke out your little native species. So sometimes we do mow, but it's a strategic mowing. It's not just a continuous mowing. And that's usually in the early stages. Here's a little larger scale mowing. This is in a solar array. We do a lot of projects in solar arrays, and some of them are quite nice. It depends on the planning and the choice of seed selection, how the project's managed. All that is really crucial to getting these projects to turn out. So we like to get involved early and help be a part of the conversation about how we're going to proceed with a project and how it's going to all the job steps involved. So, and we're not chemical free. we have to spray sometimes. And but I will say, in most cases, when we are using herbicides, we use them very carefully, judiciously. We use a concept called IPM, which I think she mentioned earlier in her presentation as well, where you choose the best process to the minimal impact environmentally, while still being effective. We use prescribed fire as a tool frequently. Many plant communities that you saw on that map earlier are dependent on fire. Not just prairies. Prairies are definitely dependent on fire. Fire was part of what kept prairies and healthy. But there are even woodland plant communities, some of the pine forest types, that required fire as part of their natural rebirth and regeneration. So now we have to, we can't just light fires and let them go willy-nilly. So we have to decide why and when and how, and that's where the word prescribed comes in. Here's a few more pictures. Our crews, generally need to get together and have a plan before they ever drop that first match. There's a lot of planning that goes into a fire, and sometimes people think, well, that was fast. Why was that so expensive? Well, we might have several weeks of planning going into it and waiting for that perfect weather. There's a lot of concerns. We have to notify the public. There's a lot of processes, getting permits, calling the officials to let them know that you're going to start the fire, let them know that the fire's done, so that when people call them, they don't send the fire trucks out with the sirens on. So we do all sorts of invasive species control. In this case, you're looking at a woodland that's infested with, I believe they're controlling garlic mustard here. That's one that can be pretty invasive in woodlands. It's on the ground layer. And we do use fire in woodlands as well. So buckthorn is our biggest woodland invader that we deal with. We do a lot of hand cutting of buckthorn, but there are times when we use mechanical equipment. But there's a lot of handwork. In most cases, handwork is best because you can avoid damaging the good stuff. So you selectively remove it. You find ways to protect the good stuff. One of the ways that we manage buckthorn without doing damage to other species is buckthorn stays green late into the fall. And I think when you guys have been seeking it out and working on your project, you notice that, like in October, it's bright green and everything else is dropping leaves. Well, that gives us an opportunity to potentially treat it with an herbicide that you can treat the buckthorn but avoid damaging the good stuff. And that's the kind of stuff, that's where we try to make the best decision we can, do the minimal impact, but achieve the goal of reducing the buckthorn so that the natural native woodland species can regenerate. We, as I mentioned, we raise plants and seed. These are some sedges, which are some of my favorite species. These are a grass in the grass family. They're kind of, a lot of the sedges seem to thrive in woodlands or wetlands. We grow probably 300 species. of different, just all different plants, grasses, wildflowers, everything. These are bags of seed in our warehouse. Each one of these bags is probably a average of 25 to 30 pounds of seed. Those are probably large grass, actually probably little blue stem. And this is a combine harvesting little blue stem field on our farm in Princeton. I think we have 80 acres of little blue stem that we harvest every year. And we burn that in the spring to rejuvenate it almost every year as well. Here, we do a lot of hand harvesting too. And that's a slow, tedious process, but a lot of species just aren't easy to farm. However, we do grow a lot of wildflowers in plots. That's wild lupine, the native wild lupine, in a plot on our Princeton farm. This is some cleaned Canada tick trefoil seed. The cleaning process is we use machines with fans and screens. This is our propagation greenhouse where they start, I don't know if you can see the little tiny seedlings coming up. They start thousands of plants in these seed flats, and then they hand transplant them out into plugs. And these are plugs laid out in the main greenhouse. So each one of those has been transplanted out by hand, and I believe we grow several 100,000 plants a year. Some more. This is our nursery up at Boreal Natives in Duluth. Those are some larger plant containers. This is our sod flats. We grow a little piece of prairie in a plastic tray that you can install and get instant prairie on a small scale. It's really cool for tiny little areas where you just want to get instant results. We also grow trees and shrubs. I should slow down and step back and remind you that we don't just grow species that are native to Minnesota. We actually find local, what we call local ecotype seed sources. So we keep records of where the seed came from, what county. We feel that that's important to the authenticity of a restoration. We feel that you can make decisions to use plant material that's local, and it will be better adapted to the project, better adapted to your site. We could get little blue stem seed from Nebraska, and it's adapted to a different season length than the little blue stem that we have here. There are differences. You can see visual differences in how it looks, even though it's the same species. That's a more extreme example, but it's an important thing to keep track of, and we believe in doing that. Anybody know this plant? It's Jack in the Pulpit. It's a woodland plant that grows in kind of wetter areas. Pretty sure you've got some down in that park.
Yeah.
The Lions Park, yeah. And this is the front yard of our Native Plant Center in Princeton. This is our retail store, or the front yard of our retail store. The backyard is full of plants. But we have stuff inside. We have seed. We have a lot of books. We have birdhouses, all that kind of stuff too. So it's a really fun place to visit, and we do events from time to time. We've done things like Christmas wreath decoration, where we use native plant materials incorporated into making your own wreath. That kind of stuff. Stuff to get you to come out and learn a little bit more about us. So you definitely something to watch for. And the place you would learn more about us and more about our events would be at our website, prairieresto.com. And I would love to answer some questions if you have any.
Josh, if someone does ask a question, please repeat it for the streaming.
Yes. So.
Okay, I've got one. So I see quite often that people want to put in native landscape, but their idea of native and what is actually native to where they live are two different things.
Yes.
So how do you have that conversation?
Right. So the question was, she sees that people want to do native plantings, but it isn't always truly native to where they actually live. And we run into that on almost a daily basis. A great example is purple coneflower. Everybody wants to plant purple coneflower. Well, the Echinacea purpurea coneflower that everybody knows is really not native to most of Minnesota. It has a few documented occurrences, but it's maybe a plant that may have been moved around a little bit in the earlier part of the previous century. But that is one of the reasons that I like to go back to the idea of being native plant community based. So we use those native plant communities as a model, and we don't use a native plant community in South Dakota as a model for a project in Sartell. We try to look at whatever we can find as close to the project, what likes to grow here. There are little remnants here and there that we find, little clues that we can see in little wild areas that tell us what wants to grow here. We can pick up clues from the soil. We use this thing we call the dot maps, which is basically a record of what was native in each county. So you see a dot in the county if it's been found and there's an herbarium specimen of that plant. So that's something that we use on a regular basis when we're putting a plant list together or seed mix together. So we do try to, generally at Prairie, we're trying to get it to the county level, usually, where we're being accurate to the county that we're in. Now, in some cases we don't need to be quite that particular. In some cases, we may not know the true answers. There might be somebody made a list of 200 plants that are native to this county, but that doesn't mean that that's the only plants that were ever found there. It's probably a lot more. So, yeah, it's worth having the conversation, and not everybody has to be 100% authentic. There are lots of plants that, for cultural reasons, people plant that are not native to the area. They're not all terrible. I'm not a believer that any non-native plant is bad. I probably thought that at one point in my career, but you come to learn that this native plant thing doesn't have to be an absolute thing. However, if you use a plant community as your goal, you're restoring a plant community, that's usually when you find the most success and you attain some success, rather than just planting what you like. So
It's going to be kind of a long question for you to repeat, so.
That's okay. I'm going to have a little water then.
Yes, that's right. So you go into a gift shop in Minnesota, and one of the things you see is a moose. Seems like every gift shop in Minnesota has a moose, and you kind of associate them. The last 15 years, the moose population has declined, arguably 50% or something like that. It's awful. And I know it's probably not Prairie Restoration, but is there a solution from your mind, from a horticultural standpoint to this problem that we're facing? Climate change is out there, and I don't know if you folks play into this solution at all with the declining moose.
Well, the question was about the fact that moose are in decline, and how might what we do relate to that. That's a tough question. I would tend to believe that the biggest factor, or the biggest stressor, is related to climate change in the decline of the moose. And we see those stressors on the plant communities as well. However, I don't know enough I know there's parasites, there's different things, but plants, animals are resilient to a point. But when they're stressed, at some point it's a little too much and you start to see decline. We see that in plants. I see places there's a lot of people who believe that even, we're losing a lot of diversity in existing wild meadows and prairies and things just because of the more dramatic fluctuations and changes. So while I don't know if there's a vegetative solution to help the moose, I think there's a lot of parallels. So
I got one other question, and it's dealing with the comment you made about the maybe only 1% of prairie kind of remains.
Mm-hmm.
Where can one go if one wants to see the prairie flowers and the prairie, if you will, today?
Well, thankfully there's a lot of restorations. A lot of parks in the area here, even City Hall or River Bluff Park in St. Cloud, there's a new restoration happening down by Talahi Woods. There's lots of examples of restorations. Remnant or true prairies is a little bit harder. One place you could look is there are what we call scientific natural areas in Minnesota. There are some prairies out in the western part of the state. Roscoe Prairie is the little town of Roscoe has a really cool little prairie. That's one of the first true remnants I ever looked at, and I was like, that was kind of where I got hooked, So.
Thank you.
I think we have to go to the next speaker, but Josh, thank you very much.
Thank you, Phil.
Good job.
Appreciate everything. Thank you.
Going to take a couple words here. One more thing. Comments of before our next speaker, Tony Dingman, who is a specialist on water. And I call Tony the heavyweight, but I think the heaviest weight we have in the room today is me. But Tony's knowledge, I've had him come last, is a segue from Kate to Josh to Tony as we talk about, the nectar of life is water, and that's Tony's specialty. Before Tony gets rocking and rolling, I did want to introduce Brian Lummel, who is our streamer, and we're so grateful that he's streaming this tonight because this will be viewed continuously at any time, and he can explain how his business, how streaming works. Like I said earlier, when I heard streaming, I was thinking of boiling water. Brian.
Thank you, Phil. I wasn't really prepared to get up today. I'm usually more comfortable behind the camera, but I appreciate the offer to be able to tell you a little bit about Bitstream TV. I'm the owner and executive producer. We're based here right in Sartell. We cover all kinds of events from charity concerts to sporting events, you name it. And I was very happy to be able to help out today with the Lions and be able to provide this service. As Phil shared, we happen to have a very rare, nice day out here in the spring, so I think a lot of you are probably working on your lawns instead of watching the presentation. But the nice part about this is that you'll be able to go back in and be able to review all of these great presentations, be able to look at the slides. You can freeze frame them, be able to look at some of the data and whatnot. And the easiest way to do that is just to go to our YouTube channel. It's bitstreamtv.live. Our website is bitstreamtv.com, which you can also get to the YouTube channel from there. And simply scroll down a little bit and you'll see past live streams, and you'll be able to click on the icon with the Lions logo, and you'll be able to rewatch this to your heart's content. I know that my wife is at home watching right now. She's very interested. She is our lawn entrepreneur at home, and she's very interested in the presentations to be able to make our lawn as pretty as it can be this spring. So thank you again, Phil. I appreciate it. I'm going to jump back behind the camera and let you guys do your thing. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Brian. And again, thanks for all the presenters. And before I introduce Tony, the reason like I mentioned about water is the Lions Park. We look at Watab Creek. Mentioned it earlier in the program that Tony has shown an interest in that. We've had coffee talking about water in Sartell. No better person than a Sartell resident, Tony Digman, to give us the wrap-up of why water is so important and what we can do about it in Sartell. Tony Digman.
Thanks, Phil. I talked to Brian. I'm going to start by moving this over a little bit. I'm so tall that I don't want to block out the screen there for you viewers. Is that all right, Brian? Yep. Okay, good. All right, as Phil said, I'm Tony Dingman. I'm an environmental specialist for the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency. I live here in Brainerd, just over by Walgreens down the street. My office is based up in Brainerd. Right now during COVID, I've been working from home for a year, but kind of my career path, I grew up in St. Cloud, just 3 miles away. I went to Cathedral High School. From there, I went to Bemidji State University, got my undergraduate and my master's degree there. And I've been with the Pollution Control Agency since 2008. From 2008 to 18, I was a biological monitoring lead, so I sampled fish and macroinvertebrates, or the aquatic bugs, out of rivers and streams. And since 2018, I moved over to our load monitoring program, so now I just work with the water quality and take water samples and sample for things like nitrogen, phosphorus, sediment, and things like that in the water. So I'm going to give a little overview here. I'm going to start at kind of a higher level, like a national level, bring it down to a Minnesota level, bring it down to the Mississippi Sartell watershed level, and then I broke it down further to just the Watab Creek itself. So I kind of will start out from the top and bring it all the way down to really local level here. So I just want to kind of touch base on where it all started with clean water. So by the late 1960s is really where unregulated dumping and pollution within our waterways nationwide really kind of hit the highest level. And these are some examples here. As you can see, even back into the 50s, it was really bad. That's a river that's actually on fire due to all of the pollution that was in the water at that time. It wasn't just industries, agriculture played a part in there, but there's also a lot of just individuals too. They just didn't have the knowledge about fertilizers and things like that. So it went from everything from industries to agriculture to individuals. But it got so bad to a point here locally in Minnesota where there were stretches of the Mississippi River near St. Paul that were void of life. There was no fish in the river whatsoever. And so that really began that period. It was in the late 1960s. And then in 1972 is when the National Clean Water Act was passed. And that really kind of kicked things off for a lot of different areas. And it gave a lot of funding to different states to try to start cleaning up the water kind of nationwide. But here in Minnesota, more locally, in 2006, the Minnesota legislature passed the Clean Water Land and Legacy Amendment. And what that does, from that point forward, we started giving 3/8% of sales tax money to the Clean Water Land and Legacy Amendment. And so that's working Minnesota-wise towards giving us more clean water. And so that's where my job and other state agencies working towards clean water, the funding comes from both Minnesota's Clean Water Land and Legacy Fund, but also from a National Clean Water Act. So I just kind of wanted to start out how we get to that point. So the MPCA doing our monitoring, I just kind of wanted to start out and tell you how we monitor. So this map right here on my right is the breakdown of Minnesota into major watersheds is what we call that. And what we do is we monitor all 80 of these watersheds, about 10 of them per year. So we get to about 8 watersheds every season is what we try to get to. And the goal of that is to obtain assessment level data. And when I say assessment level, I mean we look at the data that we collect to see if the river is meeting the standards that it should. I'll go into a little bit more detail there, but here and further on, when I say assessment, it's just that we don't just collect the fish and then that's it. We assess it based on the fish that we collect to see if it's clean water or if there's something affecting the fish populations or invertebrate populations. And so after we do those assessments, we look at, is it good enough for aquatic life, both the fish and the invertebrates that live in there? Is it good for aquatic recreation, the swimming? So we'll look at bacteria in the water based on the water chemistry samples. And then we'll also look at the fish or the aquatic consumption. So that's the consumption of fish for humans. Is there something that could be an issue there as well? So the map up there in the upper left, those are all of the sites as of 2018 that we visited and sampled for fish. There's 3,500 sites up there across Minnesota. There's 2 offices that do it, my office in Brainerd and the office in St. Paul. We basically draw a line roughly across east-west across St. Cloud. Brainerd office handles from there north, and the St. Paul handles from there south. So from about that line north, I've been to a lot of those sites north of St. Cloud. And then our map in the lower left, that's the part of the program that I'm associated with now. We have 200 sites in Minnesota that we work with local partners, local soil and water conservation districts, ourselves, and we take water chemistry samples from those 200 sites across Minnesota. And like I said, we look at nitrogen, phosphorus, bacteria, sediment in the water at those 200 sites. So it's fish and bugs up in the left, or upper left, and water quality only down there in the bottom left. Oh, I should point out, so what I'll be talking about when I get to the Mississippi Sartell is this was sampled in 2016, and being we come back every 10 years to reassess how things look, we'll be coming back to the Mississippi Sartell in 2026. So how do we sample? When we sample for fish, we use 3 types of electrofishing. Electrofishing is we walk in the stream. You can see here these 2 pictures, and we put an electric current into the water, and it shocks the fish momentarily, long enough for us to scoop them up with a net. You can see this picture here. We've got one person with that yellow rod. She's putting electricity into the water, and the other guy is scooping it up. And then there's one more person carrying a bucket. As soon as he scoops it up, puts the fish in the bucket's full of water, and the fish is swimming within seconds again. It shocks them only long enough for us to be able to scoop them up. We put them in the bucket, and they're swimming again. So it's a really effective way to find out what's in the river without having to kill the fish. And so when I say backpack, the backpack she's wearing emits all of the electricity that we need. Those are for smaller streams that we can wade into, that are shallow enough to wade and narrow enough for one person to kind of handle it. Then we have a stream shocker, this is what we primarily used here in the Watab. We actually launched at the Lions Park here, and one person pulls the boat. There's a generator that makes the power. There's a big tub of water in there that all the fish gets dumped into, and we can wade up and down there. Those are for the still wadable rivers, but too wide for one person to handle. And then we have big boats. We have a 22-foot boat that we use out on the Mississippi, and we have another boat that's a 12-foot boat that does the same thing that we stand in for narrower rivers that are still too deep to wade in, though. And then when we collect the aquatic bugs, we have a D-frame net, we call it, and we go through and we look at all the habitat, and we scrape up rocks, and we collect the invertebrates that way from the same sites that we do for fish. And then the water chemistry, we have just bottles of water, and we use a bucket that we scoop the water out of. The one place I do it locally here is there's the park down below the bridge, kind of by the holiday station there here in Sartell on the Mississippi. It's got the pier that goes out there. I sample the Mississippi there. We've done it at the Watab before. So that's that park there in Sartell on the Mississippi is one of those 200 sites there. That's probably the most local one. And this is as far as I'm going to get into talking about numbers or anything like that, but I wanted to just kind of touch base and show you how we use the data that we collect. I felt that that's an important thing, and this is how we come to assess whether the river's in good condition, moderate condition, or poor condition. And so we start with the field sampling, and then we go to sorting out. So we'll go and we'll sample all the fish, and there's times where we'll have 5,000 fish that we collect at a site. We individually put them into different buckets based on species. And we take those species and we make a raw list of those. And then we have a computer database that once we put this in here, it kicks out a more complicated number. And then that gives us a final score for that stream. Every stream in Minnesota has a threshold, and it's based on where it's located in the state and its size. So like the Watab River will never have the same threshold as the Mississippi River because it's way smaller. We don't expect to find the same fish in the shallow, slow-flowing Watab River as what we would find in the faster, deeper Mississippi River. It's the same thing as streams down by Marshall, Minnesota in the southwest part of the state have a completely different standard than those up by Duluth on the North Shore. We don't expect to find the same fish in those areas, but every river in Minnesota has a different threshold. Some of those thresholds might be the same for certain rivers, but just depending on where they are and their size, they have a different score. So the score we get here, we compare it to that threshold that that river has. And then if it's above that threshold, we can make an assumption that the river's in pretty good condition for the fish and the bugs. If it's right at that, give or take a point or two, it's in fair condition, average condition. But if it's well below that threshold, we kind of dig in further to kind of see what the problem is. So that's really where we start looking for pollutant problems or habitat problems and things like that if we find that that score is well below what it should be. So why do we look at the fish and the bugs? And what about the water? So fish are really sensitive to poor water quality and pollutants. And the thing about fish that's different from invertebrates, fish can migrate up and down the stream. They can swim. If they find a spot in the river where there's too much pollutant and they can't handle it, they'll just swim to another part of the river. They'll go downstream. Like in the Watab, if they get up to the Lions Park and they realize that's not where they want to be, they can just swim back downstream and go to the Mississippi River where they might want to be. The invertebrates, however, the reason we use both is invertebrates can't migrate so easy. Maybe they can let go of the rock and it'll wash them downstream, but they can't migrate as easily. There's invertebrates that cannot just let go of the rock or do this, that they can just go downstream. So that's why we use both. Both are very sensitive to stream conditions, and they're sensitive to quick change. So if all of a sudden a pollutant gets dumped in the water, they may not be able to get out of there so fast. But the other thing is that if we find a certain species of fish or invertebrate in one part of a stream, but not in another part of the same stream, there might be a problem where we don't find it. So we can kind of try to dig in a little bit. What's causing the problem where we're finding the fish at this section, but not this section, or the invertebrates at this section, but not this section? And as far as the water quality goes, for the water chemistry samples, it's kind of the same thing. We'll take a look, we'll sample upstream for water quality and downstream. If we find that the nitrates are really high downstream, but they were not so high upstream, we can investigate maybe what the contributor is in between those two locations. So that's kind of why we use fish, bugs, and water quality, all three on the streams. So now I'm going to move into more locally. So I was the biological monitoring lead for the Mississippi River Sartell. I went all over this watershed. It basically goes from a little southwest of Albany to northwest of Piers quite a ways. It's approximately 653,000 acres. The land use is mostly privately owned. It's 96% privately owned. It consists mostly of grass, pasture, hay, a lot of row crops and forest, but you can see it's only 6% developed, so it's not a highly developed watershed when you look outside of Sartell. It does not get into St. Cloud. The St. Cloud and the Sauk River watersheds are completely different, so it does not cut out anything. You can see Sartell is here, so it pretty much cuts off on the southern edge of Sartell here. One other interesting thing, it's got about 880 total river miles within this watershed. So there are a lot of river miles within this watershed. And there's 232 lakes, which cover over 13,000 acres of water within the watershed as well. So,
Tony, can you point out the Watab?
Yep.
Two forks of the Watab on
Yep, actually, Phil, the next, I have a map coming up that'll, they flow from roughly here into there, but I have a closer up map coming up.
I remember that map now.
Yep.
Thank you.
So these red dots that you can see, I hope you can see, those are symbols of the 59 total sites that we sampled for fish and invertebrates. I was at every single one of those red sites, red dots. I sampled fish and invertebrates there. I have all the data for every one of those, so I'll just say it now that in case I forget to say it later, if you want data on any one of those, feel free to let me know. I have a handout in the back. It's got every one of the site locations and names on it that you could pick up if you'd like, and just let me know and I could give you some more information on that. Overall, the fish are in fair condition. We sampled anywhere between 2 and 27 species of fish at those sites. And we had anywhere 25 was the lowest number of individuals we found, and we had over 2,000 at the highest station. The macroinvertebrates are in good condition. They were better than what the fish were. And I go into a little more detail here. As far as the streams go, 73% of the segments met aquatic life standards, which, like before I said, each stream has that threshold. So 73% of them were at or above their threshold for what we expected to find for fish and bugs, which left 27 that did not. That doesn't mean that Sartell's out of the norm. There's watersheds that are much worse than that, where those two could be flip-flopped, and there's watersheds that are a little bit better, but it just, some streams just don't fare as well, don't have as good a habitat, maybe have a little bit different flow dynamics, more water, less water, where it's just not as many fish holding when we sampled. And as far as aquatic recreations, we found there was a bit of a bacteria problem found where we did collect water samples in this watershed, noting that 70% of the waters did not meet aquatic recreation standards. So that's for swimming, things such as bacteria. So in 70% of the streams in the watershed, there was too high a bacteria to recreate or swim inside of the streams. That's not saying you can't ever go swimming in one of the streams, or you can't let your dog down to the stream or anything. It's just saying that prolonged time after time use in there might lead to some issues in there. So that's not to say that 70% of the streams in this watershed cannot be touched or recreated in. It's just, like I said, time after time may lead to some issues. And then I just put a little bit on the lake here that 90% of those lakes did meet aquatic life goals. So for fish, and of all those lakes, only 3 failed to meet the aquatic recreation or swimming standards. So, so overall, they're looking pretty good. I feel like you I'll go into even more depth, but this is where the Watab, this is the South Fork. It kind of runs down to St. Joe and connects up and comes to Sartell, and then this is the North Fork that flows in here as well. So there's the map I was looking for. So now I'm getting a little more closer to home here. So this is the Watab River itself, and so if you went kind of southwest on County Road 2 out of St. Joe about 3 or 4 miles and you took a right on a county road there, it would lead you to this site here. And at this point, it is really just a small ditch that's as wide as this table. It's very small, very shallow, slow flowing. And then once it gets up to here, it gets a bit wider. It's probably 25, 30 feet wide in places, a little bit deeper, a little faster flow. But this is considered the Watab South Branch, or the South Fork Watab. So these 2 sites are on that section of the stream. And then it connects up there where I have that 16 UM082. That's the North Fork of the Watab River. And then once those 2 connect, just to the right of the 2, now we're just talking the Watab Creek. And so now there's no forks anymore. So it's just those 2 connect and make that one. And so the South Fork Watab does have a little bit slower flow with limited habitat, and when I say coarse substrate, it was very rare. So coarse substrate is any type of rocks whatsoever, gravel, larger rocks, or anything. It was really quite rare to see that in that section of stream. The North Fork had a little bit faster flow. It still had limited habitat and slightly more coarse substrate, but still it was quite lacking. And then the main step Watab had increased flow as you came from west to east. So from like St. Joe and out that way towards Sartell, the gradient picks up. It has a little bit faster flow. And then with that faster flow, it does tend to have a little bit more areas with some coarse substrate because that increased flow can keep the sediment going downstream and kind of clean off the rocks. So I took these pictures when we were sampling. Like I said, we launched at the Lions Park. We carried our canoe, electroshocker, the generator and everything right down the, parked in the parking lot and carried it right down the tar path right to the river there. We jumped in and then we walked. We always shock from downstream to upstream, so we walked downstream about 100 yards and then shocked almost all the way to Pinecone Road, in and out of there. So these were pictures I took along there. There are some issues. You know, here you can see that this bank is quite bare of vegetation on there, and it's got quite a bit of erosion there. So that's got some issues there. You can see it does have a decent riparian zone. It's not mowed right up to the edge or anything, but similar to the rest of the river upstream of here, there was very little coarse substrate in here. And it's just almost like a sand desert walking up and down this stream. There's very little vegetation that's growing in it and very few rocks. The one thing that it did have for substrate is you could see, I put this in here just to kind of show the stumps coming out of there. The one is a human up there because she's collecting invertebrates out of there when we were there. But it did have a fair amount of woody debris that the fish and the invertebrates could hang on to and hide in. But other than that, it was kind of lacking in habitat for the fish and bugs. I don't expect you to look at all this, but I wanted to put down the list of fish that we found at that site. So we found 25 species of fish, which is the second most that we found in the watershed. The only one that was more was on the Platte River, north of Royalton. We found 27 species at a site on the Platte River. And so there were several sensitive species, and I just want to note, when I say sensitive species, what I mean by that is they're sensitive to pollutants. So they will die, they will evacuate the area if there is too much of a pollutant that they can't handle. So those include a list there, but as you can see, I put in parentheses the number of those that we found. We only found one, so there was very little sensitive species. What brings up that score I was talking about, or makes a stream score higher for fish, is when you find a lot of sensitive species, because that means it has really good water quality, really good habitat. So when you find a lot of sensitive species, it kind of shows that there's a broad range of habitat for them. So my point being is that just because there's a lot of fish doesn't mean that the river's necessarily healthy, because there were more tolerant species in here than there were sensitive species. So there's more species that can tolerate pollutants or a lack of habitat than what there were sensitive species. And that's where the sensitive ones are all down here towards the bottom with one that we found. But the sensitive ones. The tolerant ones were the shiners and the sunfish and the suckers. You can kind of see they kind of make up most of the top for the numbers that we found. So this site did score below that threshold that we found. It wasn't drastically below it, but it was below it. And which is kind of opposite, I'll go to the next slide, is this kind of shows the numbers that we found in the other stations. So 16 UM82 was on the North Fork of the Watab. That one actually scored above its threshold that we were talking about, even though it only had 14 species. So it had almost half the number species of fish, but it had some species in there that are a little bit more sensitive to pollutants, and so it allowed it to score a little bit higher. And these two sites on the South Fork Watab also scored below the threshold, but again, they weren't drastically below. It wasn't that the standard was a 40 and they scored a 5. I think they scored in the low 30s is where they were about. So last thing I should point out about the fish, we sample any fish that is 1 inch or bigger. Anything from 1 inch up to, we've caught 60-inch sturgeon before when we were doing the Rainy River up by Canada. So it's anything. And I think what people a lot of times associate that we're only looking for game fish or big fish, and that is not the case, because a lot of times the minnow species that we find, they're the ones that are the most sensitive to the pollutants, are the minnow species. So a lot of times most of our fish will be made up of non-game species of fish. And one of my most enjoyable things is, so 59 sites, I talked to 59 landowners to get permission to to sample those sites, and half of them, there's no fish in there, don't even waste your time. And then I would come back with a list of 15 different species of fish, and they never knew that those fish were in those streams. And so it was interesting for them to see, well, I never knew, or what is a central mud minnow, or what is a Johnny Darter, or something like that. So I've got pictures of some of those back there on the wall you can go and check out, but that was something a lot of people don't associate with these streams. And things like that, when you apply them, how you apply them. Loss of species, so that would be invasive species, kind of Josh mentioned a lot of that too, just kind of controlling the invasive species, protecting the drinking water supplies, and protecting swimming areas from bacteria. Like I said, the lack of coarse substrate within the stream, a lot of erosion along stream leads to that. The input of sediment into the water washes up onto those rocks, and if there's not enough flow to carry that sediment away, it just covers up the rocks. And that's the habitat that we need for fish and bugs. And so kind of stopping that erosion is something that's really important. And then the loss of wetlands. Josh hit on the loss of prairies, and I'm sure you know about the lack of wetlands as well, but just this watershed specifically has lost an estimated 60,000 acres of wetlands historically. So that's a lot of wetlands. It's hard to tell the difference here. This south 2 rivers is actually a different color than the rest. That's actually in the 50 to 75 percentile range that wetlands have been lost. So that's a big loss of historic wetlands. And then the bright green are less than 25, and then that middle kind of yellowish section is 25 to 50%. So you can kind of see how the wetlands have disappeared throughout this watershed specifically. So watersheds are super important during high flood seasons. They hold water so that the water just doesn't rush down the Watab River all at one time. Those wetlands got to fill up first, and then they slowly let the water out. They filter out excess nutrients, so high nitrates, phosphorus, the cattails and the different plants in there soak all that stuff up. And then it's also critical habitat for both aquatic and terrestrial plants. So the loss of wetlands is big for both terrestrial and aquatic organisms. I'm almost done. What can we do? So a couple of things are protecting the riparian zone. So call Josh. Have him work with him, but this is just an example of rocks. You know, I just put a protecting the riparian zone. The water's coming down like this, it's just washing on that bank there. So prior to putting in rocks, it just eroded it away, contributing sediment. Reduce the use of salt in the winter. So this is a big thing people don't talk about very much, but this is just a picture of salt laying here. Once salt enters a lake or a stream, it can never get taken out. It's in there permanently. And salt increases the salinity, which causes low dissolved oxygen in the water. So that is a big problem for fish and invertebrates. They can only tolerate that oxygen so low, and then they die. So the excess salt washes into rivers and streams and lowers that. It reduces growth and reproduction and limits the food availability. So just kind of limiting the amount of salt we put on sidewalks and on roads and stuff is a big thing. People don't think dumping grass clippings and leaves into the streams is a big deal or their lakes, but it's really super fertilizes the streams and the rivers big time, because you think about fertilizing your lawn, it gets soaked up by the grass, you dump that into the stream, and now all of a sudden that nitrogen and the phosphorus that it's soaked up is now in the river. And so that decomposes into the river, basically causing excess fertilizer, lower oxygen levels. On top of, if you're dumping sticks and leaves and things like that into the river, it can block up culverts and things like that. So, and then just reducing fertilization on the yards and just kind of being careful when you put it on there. That causes algae blooms and reduced oxygen. this is one of my favorite pictures to kind of show people about sediment. This is the Mississippi and the Minnesota where they join down by Jordan, and you can see how much sediment comes down the Minnesota River and then joins the clearer water of the Mississippi River there. So it's kind of crazy. I know the Minnesota River, you know, it has a ton of erosion. I've done a lot of electrofishing down there, and just all the banks are just solid erosion down there, and it just contributes a lot of sediment. So without the protection, that's what the Mississippi could look like, you know, if we didn't protect the shorelines and keep the sediment out of the rivers. And so for more information, you can jot down my phone number, my email. That's the PCA's website. I have tons of handouts, probably more than Phil wanted me to bring back there. And the Mississippi River Watershed page, you can go to the website and then, or you can just Google Mississippi River Sartell Watershed, and there's a report that details all of the stuff that I just went over. More than that, I wrote that report and it's like 200 pages long, and you can go through and go pick out what you want. It's too long, to be honest, but you can go in there and learn more about the watershed, find out specifics about the river that you're interested in or the areas you're interested in, or any other watershed for that matter. And we have a new tool on there. You can click on certain sites, find out the fish we found and things like that. So I think that's it.
Any questions for Tony?
That was a lot of information, and
I've got a question.
Yeah.
Okay, so, boundary waters.
Yep.
And I know it's probably not in your,
I've electrofished in the boundary waters.
okay? Well, it's a place I probably have been up there 50 times.
Yep.
For the last 15 years. And, the story is it's some of the cleanest water on the planet and this and that. I'm curious, how clean is it? Is it in danger? Just from a professional's perspective,
Yep.
what do we have? What is it?
So it from a perspective of like residential and industrial pollution, it is very clean because there's not a lot of that up there, right? Which is why there's a big debate going on whether you should bring in industrial stuff like mines and things like that, because it could introduce pollution. So they are very clean water. When you go up there, you notice it's a little bit more brown water. It's not, you know, the gin clear water that you see. That comes from the tannic color from all this. There's a lot of wetlands up there and swamps. That comes from that kind of the swamps and the water coming out of those wetlands and stuff. That's just the natural color of swamps like that. So a good example would be the Platte River here. If you go up to the Platte, it's clear, but if you look at it, it's got a brown tinge to it. Well, the Platte flows through two gigantic wetlands, and that's kind of gives it that brownish color. So, but yes, for the most part, I don't want to say all, but for the most part, the water is clean in the boundary waters. Yes, good for eating fish and swimming and things like that. Yep, there's not that none of the lakes have excess nutrients or anything, but there's you know, there's limited big algae blooms up there because there's not a lot of excess nitrates and phosphorus and things like that coming from extra sources like cities and stuff. Yeah.
Maybe one other question. Turn the clock back 50, 75 years. Minnesota was one of the premier milk producing states, dairy producing states. It's dropped off significantly. I don't even know if it's in the top 10 nationally. And I'm curious if you have seen an improvement as a result of the lack of, you know, fertilizer, phosphorus, nitrates, those type of things from the decline in the dairy manufacturing. Sure.
I can't, I'm not in the feedlots program, which we have a feedlot program, which would know more, but I can say that I don't know if it's because of the decline in the numbers. It might be contributed more that since the 60s, there's been more regulations on being able to not dump your, you know, cow manure into the stream, or you have to now have a holding tank or a pond for your manure and things like that. So I don't know if it's because of the lack of numbers or just there's now more oversight on when you can apply the fertilizer onto the fields now, and the push to not apply the fertilizer when you know a big rainstorm's coming, because that's all going to get washed over into the stream now. So I can't answer 100% one way or another, but it might be a combination of both. There's maybe less dairy farms, but there's more increased kind of oversight on what happens on those farms. Yep. Yep.
Tony, I'm curious if any of your sites are stream. I've been seeing in the last 10 years stream restoration being a big thing.
Mm-hmm.
Toewood restoration or stream bank restoration, where it really change, and even changing of the flow in some of the urban streams where they add riffles and things like that.
Yep.
I'm wondering if any of your sites you've tested before and after restoration, and if you've, what kind of changes you've seen.
So that's part of the program that's in right now. So when, at that original map, when I said we go back every 10 years, we have sites that started in 2019 that were originally monitored in 2009 that we went back to in 2019, and we're right now looking at the results of that. There have been huge projects that have been done for restoration. There's been dams taken out for fish migration work, stream bank restoration and everything. So yes, we have done that, and that's why we go back every 10 years and reassess, because those projects have now been completed. Once we figure out where the issues are, we work with the local conservation district and Board of Water and Soil Conservation districts and things like that. And they complete those projects within that 10 years, and then we go back to see how the fish, invertebrates, and water quality has improved, declined, or stayed the same. So I don't have any from here in the Sartell because we won't be back here till 2026, but I know there's projects that are on the ground happening. So unfortunately.
Would you say there are some success stories?
I would definitely say there's success stories, yes. But at the same time, I'm sure, there probably are some that aren't as well. Yes, there are definitely success stories, especially when you start talking in the western part of the state. There was a lot of just dams that prohibited fish migration, which then decreased the habitat in the stream, and they just they put in riffles with rocks now and took out the dam so the fish can swim upstream to original spawning grounds and things. So there's documented things like that definitely show a lot of success stories. Yes, and it's across the state, not just western part, but all over. Yep.
One last question. So Saturday, May 15th is the fishing opener.
Yep.
Where will Tony Dingman be?
Saturday, May 15th, I'll be coaching a softball game. But after that, I've spent the last 5 openers on Sunday just out here on the Mississippi. I launched right at the access there on the other side, the main access there, and I fished the Mississippi. I fished the Mississippi in Sartell more than anywhere else in the state.
Right?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
Do you eat the fish?
Do I eat the fish? Yeah. Yep. I don't eat bass because I'm a bass fisherman. I throw them all back. But I eat catfish and walleyes from the river. I've eaten northerns from the river. Yeah. Yep. I eat them. I don't eat fish a lot there. I don't eat multiple meals a week. But yes, I eat fish out of the river. Yeah. Yep.
Any other questions for Tony? Tony, thank you so
Yep.
much.
Thank you, Phil.
Wow, I got to say, one thing I want to say about Tony, I was ready for him to say if he's fishing, he's with his family, because this guy takes his family hunting. I mean, but all our speakers tonight, Katie, thank you so much. Josh, Tony, this is a Earth Day forum, and with the knowledge that was shared tonight, this is quite a forum. And I just regret that we didn't have live audience, but with COVID, I understand, with a beautiful day. But I'm so grateful that Brian did the Bit TV streaming. And if copyright or whatever we have, if accessibility is an option, we could have this and maybe some of the slides on our Sartell Lions Facebook page. And we will get that information out so people would have a place to access it, or a referral to Bitstream TV that Brian has shared with us. So thank you all for coming. One last word for volunteers for the city, for the gardens throughout the city. The city does look for people to help. Just like Lions Club needs members, just like Mother Earth needs stewards of our planet. So as we end this forum, I just again want to say thanks. Stick around, talk to the presenters. Please take some water. And Tony's family gets the cookies if no one else does. And the flyers are all there for the taking. Have a good night. Thank you.